Let's get one thing clear before we go any further. The greatest danger in your life is rarely the person who openly dislikes you. Open hostility is loud, obvious, and usually clumsy. The real danger is quiet. It smiles at you. It asks how your day was. It remembers small details about you that you never recall sharing. And because it looks harmless, polite, even caring, most people never see it coming until something in their life starts to unravel. This is not a story meant to scare you. It is meant to sharpen you. Stoic philosophy teaches that awareness is the first act of self-preservation, and nothing destroys inner peace faster than ignoring what your instincts are already trying to tell you. Today we begin with the first and most overlooked warning sign that someone in your life may not simply dislike you, but may wish you harm in a far more calculated way. This sign is what I call the silent observer. The silent observer is not aggressive, dramatic, or openly threatening. In fact, that is precisely what makes them dangerous. They watch without being seen. They gather information without asking obvious questions. They appear in your environment just often enough to feel coincidental, never frequent enough to raise alarm. At first, it feels like chance. You notice them at your favorite coffee shop, then at the gym, then at the grocery store, always around the same time you are. Your rational mind jumps in quickly, dismissing the pattern. It's a small town, similar schedules, coincidence. Stoicism warns us about this exact trap. We are taught to trust reason, but reason must be guided by observation, not denial. When something disrupts your sense of inner order, it is not weakness to question it, it is wisdom. A silent observer studies routines. They notice when you leave, when you return, who you talk to, and when you are alone. They know your habits before you consciously realize you have them. And the most unsettling part is that they never announce themselves. They do not demand attention. They do not cross obvious lines. They rely on your politeness, your benefit of the doubt, and your fear of appearing paranoid. Predatory personalities understand that most people would rather doubt themselves than accuse someone else without proof. That hesitation is not kindness. It is vulnerability. There is a crucial distinction here that Stoicism makes very clear. Curiosity seeks understanding. Surveillance seeks control. The silent observer is not interested in knowing you as a human being. They are interested in predicting you. Control always begins with predictability. When someone seems to know where you will be before you arrive, when they reference details about your life you never remember offering, when they appear by chance, too often to be random, you are not being dramatic for noticing. You are being attentive. In a hyper-connected world, observation does not require physical proximity alone. Social media, mutual acquaintances, shared spaces, and digital footprints make it easy for someone to map your life without ever speaking to you directly. A Stoic understands that peace of mind does not come from pretending danger does not exist, but from seeing reality clearly and responding with discipline. Ignoring patterns does not make you virtuous. It makes you unprepared. The silent observer often hides behind harmless explanations. They are just around. They happen to be nearby. They didn't think it was a big deal. And because they do nothing overtly wrong, you feel unreasonable for feeling unsettled. But Stoicism teaches us to respect the signals of the mind when they are grounded in repeated observation. Discomfort that arises from patterns is not fear. It is information. Here is where many people fail themselves. They wait for a dramatic event before they take their own instincts seriously. A threat, a confrontation, a clear violation. But by the time those appear, the observer has already gathered what they need. The Stoic approach is not to panic, but to adjust. You do not announce suspicion. You do not confront impulsively. You become less predictable. You guard information. You limit access. You observe the observer. Power shifts the moment. Awareness replaces denial. Epictetus taught that we suffer not from events themselves, but from our judgments about them. The silent observer thrives on your judgment that it's probably nothing. Wisdom asks a different question. What if it isn't? Not with fear, but with preparedness. You are not obligated to explain your boundaries. You are not required to keep access open to anyone who makes your inner order uneasy. Stoicism is not about tolerating everything. It is about choosing what you allow to influence your life. If someone appears in your world repeatedly without a clear reason, if their presence feels invasive rather than natural, if your peace subtly erodes when they are near, do not rush to silence that feeling. Sit with it, observe, adjust. Protect your routines and your privacy. Awareness is not paranoia. It is the foundation of self-respect. The silent observer is dangerous not because they act quickly, but because they wait. And the Stoic does not wait to be harmed before becoming wise. He sees clearly, acts deliberately, and preserves his inner citadel before it is ever under siege. Now that you understand the silent observer, we move to a far more destructive and psychologically violent sign, one that rarely looks dangerous on the surface, yet dismantles lives quietly and efficiently. This is the second sign, the saboteur strategy. Unlike the silent observer who gathers information, the saboteur uses that information to isolate you, weaken your position, and quietly dismantle the systems that protect you. This is not random cruelty. This is calculated erosion. The saboteur does not attack you directly. Direct attacks invite defense, witnesses, and accountability. Instead, they work indirectly, behind the scenes, shaping how others see you long before you realize anything is wrong. Suddenly, conversations feel colder. Invitations stop coming. Your ideas are questioned more than before. Your words are misunderstood, then remembered incorrectly. You start sensing resistance, but you cannot pinpoint its source. That confusion is intentional. Psychology has long confirmed something deeply unsettling. Once a negative idea about someone is introduced, even subtly, it lingers. Even if disproven later, it stains perception. The saboteur understands this instinctively. They never accuse outright. They imply. They worry. They just want to make sure you're okay. They phrase poison as concern. Have you noticed how stressed they've been lately? I'm not saying anything bad. I just feel something is off. These statements are weapons disguised as empathy. What makes this strategy especially dangerous is fragmentation. Each comment, each whisper, each small suggestion seems harmless on its own, but together they form a pattern of doubt. Your boss begins to question your reliability. A friend becomes distant. A family member suddenly treats you as if you are unstable or difficult. And when you finally feel the need to defend yourself, you sound reactive, emotional, even guilty, because the narrative has already been planted without you present to challenge it. Stoic philosophy warns us against reacting blindly to chaos. Marcus Aurelius wrote that clarity must come before action. The saboteur thrives when you panic, over-explain, or attempt to chase every rumor. They want you distracted, emotionally exhausted, constantly trying to repair damage you didn't cause. The more you scramble, the more you appear unstable, and the more their quiet narrative seems justified. This is why the Stoic response is discipline, not desperation. You do not argue with shadows. You do not beg for understanding from people who have already been influenced. Instead, you anchor yourself in facts, patterns, and long-term character. You document. You observe who changes toward you and when. You notice who benefits from your isolation. You tighten your circle, not out of bitterness, but out of strategic clarity. The saboteur's true goal is not to insult you, it is to remove your support system. Isolation makes people vulnerable. When trust erodes around you, you are easier to discredit, easier to overwhelm, easier to corner. This is not accidental. This is a campaign. And campaigns are won not by emotion, but by awareness and restraint. Stoicism teaches that reputation is not controlled in moments, but revealed over time. The saboteur relies on urgency, on your need to fix everything immediately. The wise person resists that impulse. You allow truth to emerge through consistency, not arguments. You let your actions contradict the lies quietly, steadily. And most importantly, you stop granting access to anyone who repeatedly misunderstands you in ways that always harm you. There is a hard truth here that Stoicism does not soften. Not everyone who smiles at you wishes you well, and not every betrayal announces itself loudly. Some arrive softly, politely, disguised as concern. When you sense that your life is becoming fragmented without clear cause, when conflicts surround you but never include the same instigator openly, stop assuming coincidence. Step back, regain perspective. Protect your integrity and your peace. You are not obligated to prove your innocence to manipulators. You are obligated to protect your mind, your name, and your future. The saboteur loses power the moment you stop reacting emotionally and start responding strategically. Awareness is not aggression, it is survival. In the next part, we move even deeper into the darkness, into the most deceptive role of all, the false friend facade, where danger does not arrive as an enemy, but as someone who claims to care about you. Now we step into the most deceptive territory of all, the place where danger wears warmth, where threat disguises itself as care, and where your guard naturally lowers because everything feels familiar and safe. This is the third sign, the false friend facade, and it is one of the oldest and most effective strategies used by people who intend harm while appearing loyal. The false friend is not loud, not hostile, not obviously unstable. Instead, they arrive as comfort, as interest, as someone who suddenly wants to know everything about you, your routines, your struggles, your hopes, your disappointments, your fears. And at first it feels validating, even healing, because humans are wired to relax when we feel understood. But here is the danger. True friendship grows with time, shared experience, and mutual risk, while manipulation grows through speed, intensity, and access. When someone moves too quickly into your inner world without earning that trust naturally, it is not intimacy, it is reconnaissance. These individuals ask questions that feel caring but are strategically placed. They remember details you did not emphasize. They follow up on vulnerabilities you casually mentioned. They position themselves as helpful, available, indispensable, and the more you open up, the more invisible power you hand them. Stoic philosophy warns us clearly about this. Seneca wrote that trust should be given slowly and withdrawn quickly when integrity is in question, because a person who has access to your weaknesses has leverage over your peace. The false friend listens not to support you, but to catalog you. Every insecurity becomes a pressure point. Every regret becomes potential leverage. Every personal detail becomes context for future manipulation. What makes this sign so dangerous is that it feels good at first. You feel seen, supported, understood. And predators understand this better than anyone. They mirror your language, reflect your emotions, validate your frustrations, and even share selective vulnerabilities of their own to create the illusion of mutual depth. But all of it is measured. All of it is controlled. They are not building connection. They are building control. From a Stoic perspective, this is where emotional discipline becomes survival, because Stoicism does not teach emotional suppression. It teaches emotional discernment, the ability to pause and ask, why is this person here? Why now? Why so intense? And what do they gain from access to my life? A true friend respects your boundaries. A manipulator pushes past them gently while smiling. A true friend does not rush intimacy. A false friend accelerates it because speed prevents scrutiny. You must understand this clearly. Not everyone who offers help deserves proximity. Not everyone who listens deserves your truth, and not everyone who shows interest has honorable intent. The Stoics taught that wisdom is not paranoia, it is pattern recognition. And when someone suddenly inserts themselves deeply into your life without history, without shared hardship, without earned trust, wisdom demands caution, not gratitude. This does not mean you become cold or suspicious of everyone. It means you slow the pace, you limit disclosure, you observe consistency, and you allow time to reveal character. The false friend cannot tolerate patience because patience exposes them. When you stop oversharing, they become frustrated. When you stop granting access, they lose interest or escalate their behavior. And that shift alone tells you everything you need to know. Remember this, friendship is not proven by words or concern. It is proven by respect for boundaries, by consistency without intrusion, by support without control. Stoicism teaches that peace is preserved not by isolating yourself, but by choosing carefully who is allowed into your inner world. If someone feels too close too fast, if their curiosity feels invasive rather than supportive, if your instincts feel unsettled, even when logic says everything is fine, do not dismiss that signal. Your instincts are not weakness, they are ancient intelligence. The false friend is not there to protect you, they are there to learn you, and once they know you well enough, they know exactly where to strike. In the next section, we will examine the fourth sign, escalating aggression, where harm begins as jokes, proximity tests, and boundary violations before revealing its true and dangerous intent. Now we move into the most terrifying shift of all, the moment where intention begins to leak through behavior, where what once felt strange starts to feel threatening. This is the fourth sign, escalating aggression, and it is where danger stops being theoretical and starts becoming real. Escalating aggression rarely begins with obvious violence, because obvious violence triggers resistance, witnesses, consequences, so instead it arrives disguised as humor, as awkwardness, as moments you are encouraged to brush off, comments like, "I could kill you for that," followed by laughter, jokes about accidents, casual references to harm framed as sarcasm, but none of this is random. These moments are tests. They are psychological probes designed to measure your boundaries, your fear response, and most importantly, your tolerance. Each time you laugh nervously, minimize the discomfort, or convince yourself you are being too sensitive, the line moves. The Stoics warned repeatedly about this exact pattern, not in modern language, but in principle. Seneca wrote that evil reveals itself gradually because sudden exposure would cause it to be resisted, and this is precisely how escalating aggression operates. It conditions you, first emotionally, then psychologically, then physically. What begins as verbal discomfort slowly becomes physical intrusion, standing too close, unnecessary touch, blocking exits, appearing in confined spaces, and each step is calibrated to see how much you will accept before pushing further. This is not poor social awareness, it is deliberate boundary erosion. Consider how often people who later commit violent acts were described as odd but harmless, or creepy but nice. Those descriptions are warning labels society ignores. The person who escalates aggression studies reactions closely. They notice when you flinch, when you freeze, when you avoid confrontation, and they adjust their behavior accordingly. If you resist early, they retreat or redirect. If you tolerate, they advance. This is why ignoring early discomfort is not kindness, it is danger. Stoicism does not teach endurance of harm, it teaches endurance of hardship while protecting what is essential, and your safety is essential. Marcus Aurelius emphasized that we must not confuse patience with passivity, because patience without boundaries becomes self-betrayal. Escalating aggression thrives on that confusion. Let me be clear. Jokes about violence are not jokes when they make you uneasy. Repeated invasions of personal space are not accidents when they happen consistently, and discomfort is not overthinking when it appears without invitation. Your nervous system evolved for survival, not social politeness, and when it signals danger, it is responding to pattern recognition far older than conscious thought. People often hesitate at this stage because nothing overt has happened yet. But escalation is not about what has happened, it is about what is being rehearsed. Every threatening joke normalizes the idea. Every boundary crossed lowers resistance. Every tolerated violation becomes precedent. From a Stoic perspective, wisdom here is decisive clarity. You do not argue intent, you observe behavior. You do not debate whether they meant it, you evaluate how it affected you. The Stoics taught that we cannot control others, but we are fully responsible for what we allow into our lives. If someone's presence makes you feel small, trapped, or alert in a way that feels primal, distance is not cruelty, it is prudence. Escalating aggression is the stage where denial becomes most dangerous, because the mind wants certainty before action, but certainty often arrives too late. Seneca's warning that he who is forewarned is forearmed applies directly here. Forewarning does not mean waiting for proof of harm. It means acting when patterns align. This is the moment to document interactions, to limit contact, to increase visibility, to trust your instincts over social pressure, because predators rely on your fear of appearing dramatic more than they rely on strength. And here is the most important Stoic lesson in this stage. You are not required to be fair to someone who is testing your safety. Fairness is for contracts, not for threats. Protecting yourself is not an emotional reaction, it is a rational decision. In the next section, we will examine the final and most dangerous sign, the patient predator, the individual who hides behind time itself, waiting not for emotion, but for opportunity. Now we arrive at the final and most dangerous sign of all, the one that rarely triggers alarm until it is far too late, the patient predator. This is not the person who explodes in anger or makes obvious threats. This is the one who waits, calmly, quietly, methodically. Their greatest weapon is not violence, it is time. The patient predator understands something most people overlook, that urgency creates resistance, but patience dissolves suspicion. They do not rush intimacy or confrontation once the earlier stages have been established. Instead, they allow life to move forward while they remain embedded, watching, learning, adapting. They blend into your routine so completely that their presence becomes background noise, and that is exactly what makes them lethal. These individuals appear dependable. They remember birthdays. They show up consistently. They offer help without being asked. They seem harmless, even comforting. But beneath that, stability is calculation. Every question they ask serves a purpose. Every favor creates obligation. Every shared moment builds false trust. From a Stoic perspective, this is the enemy that Epictetus warned about when he said that the greatest dangers are not the ones that confront us directly, but the ones that disguise themselves as allies. The patient predator does not need to provoke you because they are not driven by emotion. They are driven by outcome. They study your routines, your weak moments, your support system, and most importantly, the moments when you are alone. They take note of when you are vulnerable, tired, distracted, grieving, or transitioning, and they wait for alignment. What makes this stage especially terrifying is that by the time it activates, the earlier warning signs are long past. The silent observation has already happened. The sabotage has already weakened your support. The false friendship has already granted access. The aggression has already tested boundaries. Now comes execution, not necessarily violent, but decisive. This is where careers are destroyed, reputations collapse, legal traps are sprung, or physical harm is attempted when conditions are optimal. And because the patient predator has invested so much time into appearing safe, any accusation against them sounds absurd to outsiders. This is why Stoicism places such heavy emphasis on vigilance even during calm. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily that he would encounter deceitful, manipulative, and harmful people, not to become fearful, but to remain prepared. Preparation is not pessimism, it is clarity. The patient predator relies on your assumption that time equals safety. They rely on the belief that if nothing bad has happened yet, nothing will. But wisdom understands that time can be a tool, not a healer. So what is the Stoic response here? It is restraint without isolation, kindness without access, and awareness without paranoia. You do not confront the patient predator emotionally because emotion gives them information. You do not overshare because information gives them leverage. You tighten boundaries quietly. You reduce predictability. You protect your routines. You limit what they know about your plans. You trust behavior over history. And, most importantly, you listen to your instincts even when logic tries to silence them. The Stoics believed that the soul has its own form of perception, one that recognizes imbalance before the mind can articulate it. If someone feels too involved, too interested, too patient in ways that do not align with genuine care, that is not coincidence, that is intent. Now, let us be absolutely clear. This is not about living in fear. This is about living awake. Someone who merely dislikes you will avoid you. Someone who wants to harm you will stay close. That is the paradox most people miss. And that is why this sign matters more than all the others combined, because by the time the patient predator reveals themselves, escape is no longer easy. Awareness is the only real defense. As this video comes toward its conclusion, understand this: if any of these 5 signs have brought a specific person to mind, do not dismiss it. Stoicism teaches us that intuition refined by reason is wisdom. You are not obligated to prove danger before protecting yourself. You are not required to explain your boundaries to those who violate them. And you are not paranoid for noticing patterns that others ignore. Knowledge is your first shield, but action is what keeps you safe. In the final part, we will bring everything together, grounding these insights in Stoic clarity and showing you how to move forward without fear, without obsession, and without sacrificing your peace. This brings us to the final truth, the one that ties everything together and gives these warnings their real purpose. This was never about fear. It was about clarity. The Stoics never taught us to live suspicious of everyone, but they did teach us to live awake. What you have just learned are not reasons to panic. They are reasons to sharpen perception. Because the greatest danger does not come from chaos. It comes from familiarity abused. Someone who truly means you harm rarely announces themselves. They observe, adapt, integrate, and wait. That is why Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that life is not threatened by events, but by our failure to judge them correctly. When you ignore patterns because they feel uncomfortable to acknowledge, you are not being kind. You are being careless with your own safety and peace. Stoic wisdom does not ask you to become cold or withdrawn. It asks you to become discerning. There is a profound difference. You can remain calm without being naive. You can remain compassionate without being exposed. You can remain strong without becoming hard. The lesson here is simple but uncompromising. Access to your life is earned, not owed. No one deserves proximity to your routines, your vulnerabilities, your future plans, or your inner world simply because they appear friendly. Trust is built slowly, tested quietly, and adjusted when reality contradicts intention. If someone's behavior unsettles you, you do not need permission to step back. If your instincts tighten around a person despite their pleasant mask, You are not imagining things, you are perceiving misalignment. Stoicism teaches that peace is not the absence of threats, but the presence of preparedness. You do not wait for harm to justify boundaries. Boundaries exist precisely to prevent harm. And the strongest boundaries are often invisible. Less explanation, less exposure, less predictability, more awareness. Remember this: the goal is not to hunt predators, it is to remove yourself from their reach. Silence can be protection, distance can be wisdom, inaction can be strategy. You do not need to confront every danger to defeat it. Sometimes the most powerful move is to quietly deny access and move forward with clarity. As Epictetus taught, no one can harm you unless you grant them entry into your inner citadel. Guard it well. Let this knowledge make you steady, not fearful, alert, not obsessed, confident, not aggressive. And above all, let it restore your trust in yourself. Because when you learn to trust your perception, you stop being an easy target. This is where the story ends, not with anxiety, but with sovereignty. Stay calm, stay aware, stay alive.